Of the great empire of China, which had been for centuries the center of civilization in Asia, the Romans knew nothing. Though China's history had begun almost 2,000 years before Rome was founded, the Romans had heard nothing of it. They only had a vague idea that somewhere in far eastern Asia lived a people who made silk. Therefore, far east in Asia, on Strabo's map of the world, appears merely the word Ceres. And of this new Roman Empire, which had so recently sprung up, the Chinese knew nothing except that somewhere out in the west were barbarians who wished to purchase silk. These were the two great empires of the world, China and Rome, yet they knew nothing of each other. Their only connection was a slender thread of silk. Stretching its length across the wide expanse of Central Asia ran a narrow caravan trail, later to be known as the Old Silk Road. Over that trail on camelback, bales of precious Chinese silk were carried westward for 6,000 miles. Over the silent, burning desert went the caravans, across barren steppes, through deep mountain passes, in sandstorm and blizzard, heat and winter fog. From Shenxi and Huanghe, the Yellow River, the camels, with their tinkling bells and loaded backs, padded out through the Jade Gate, the last in the Great Wall, and months later knelt to be unloaded in the capital of the Parthians on the Euphrates River, or in the market of Damascus. From there the bales of silk might be taken around the Sea of Galilee, down to Tyre and Sidon, to be embroidered with gold thread, or dyed with the famous Tyrian purple, before being loaded on galleys and shipped to Rome. This caravan trail had been opened about 130 years before this by a famous Chinese traveler in the reign of the Emperor Wu. That was the first time that the Chinese had gone outside their own empire. They had believed and called it all that is under heaven. It was not to sell silk, but because of the Huns that the great traveler had been sent out by the Chinese emperor. China was in constant danger of being attacked by the semi-savage tribes of wild horsemen who inhabited Central Asia. These savage tribes raided and plundered the civilized nations east and west of them, from China to Parthia. The Parthians called them the Scyths. The Chinese name for them was a Swing-Nu or Huns. As a protection against these barbarians, the Chinese had built a great wall which ran over hills and valleys along the northern border for 1,500 miles. Wu Ti extended the wall and added more watchtowers. But the wall only helped to keep out the Huns. It did not defeat them. Against these wild hordes, the Chinese were obliged to wage almost continual war. Wu Ti decided that, instead of waiting for the Huns to attack, as been done in the past, he would send an army outside of the Great Wall and drive back the Huns beyond the Gobi Desert. This still would not be final. The Huns might return, and there were no people outside the western wall to break their advance. Formerly, just outside the western end of the Great Wall, there had lived a people called the Yuezhi. But they had been attacked and defeated by the Huns, who had killed their king and used his skull as a drinking cup. Not strong enough to take revenge on their enemies, the sad-hearted Yuezhis had packed up their tents and moved with their herds of sheep and oxen far to the west. On the border of Parthia they found a new home. Wu Ti wished them to return to their old place between China and the Huns. So it was with an invitation to these people to return and accept the protection of China that Emperor Wu had sent out a brave young officer by the name of Chang Qian. Chang Qian was also able to bring back horses. The Chinese needed horses to fight with the Huns, for the Huns were wild-riding horsemen. A caravan of 100 men started with Chang Qian on the dangerous mission out into the then trackless spaces of Asia. Only 2 reached their destination in the west, and it was 12 years before the brave Chang Qian himself returned to China. He had been captured by the Huns and held prisoner for 10 years. When he returned, he brought word that the Yuezhi would not come back. They were contented where they were. But he brought the horses and alfalfa seed to plant for their food. and many were the tales he had to tell. He was hailed and honored by his countrymen, and upon him was bestowed the title of Great Traveler. So the way to the west had been opened, the slender trail across the plains, deserts, and mountain passes of Asia. Over it, silk spun in far-off Chinese courtyards was now being carried westward to be worn by unknown ladies of Rome. Along that trail, caravans were continually traveling, and would continue to travel for another 200 years. Then Chinese control over the tribes of Asia would grow too weak to hold it open. The tinkle of camel bells would no longer be heard along the old Silk Road. The sand would drift in and cover that slender trail, and it would sink again back into the desert. The history of China began about 2,000 years before Rome was founded, but many cities before that, the black-haired people, as the Chinese called themselves, must have begun to till the fertile yellow soil along the Huanghe. Then, like all other early people, they had felt the world about them to be full of unseen spirits. In the great winding river whose water gave life to their fields, there seemed to be a friendly dragon with a winding tail, a helpful spirit, except when he was angry. Then he lashed about. The water rose, flooded the fields, and swept away the tiny huts. In the shape of clouds gathering in the summer sky, the Chinese farmer, looking up, could see another dragon, the good sky dragon who sent the gentle summer rain. Against the sky, under the jagged outline of the mountains, could easily be seen the shape of still another dragon, which slept beneath the earth, guarding its riches. And so the dragon, which represented to the Chinese the life and fertility of their land, came to be the symbol of China. To the question of who had made the world and how it had been created, these early people would have said Pan Ku. When all was confusion and disorder, Pan Ku, a mighty being, had lifted up the heavens. Holding the sun in one hand and the moon in the other, he put them into their places. Then he had spread out the earth like a carpet and lain down to die. His head had formed the mountains, his bones the rocks, his flesh the soil. His blood made rivers and streams, his breath was the wind, and in thunder could be heard his voice. Centuries passed. The early myth about Pan Ku no longer satisfied the sages or wise men of ancient China. Looking about them, they saw that everything in the world seemed to have its opposite. There was light and darkness, heat and cold, giving and taking, man and woman, birth and death, good and evil. In that lay the secret of creation, they said. Two forces, acting upon each other, made up the universe. By a circular symbol, half black, half white, they showed how the two forces, yang and yin, fitted together and made a perfect whole. Yang was all that was light and warm and heavenly. It was alive and active. Yin was solid and still, dark, cold, and earthy. In man himself, yang and yin were also blended. From yang came a man's mind and spirit, and when he died they would return again to the heavenly yang. His passions and vices came from yin, and when he died would return to the dark earth. Following this teaching, the people learned to worship and offer sacrifices to the departed spirits of their ancestors and pray to them for help. They also offered sacrifice to the spirits of earth and all spirits, good or bad, just to be on the safe side. And while they believed there were many spirits in the world, over and above them all, they believed, there was the one great spirit of goodness. They called it heaven. The king was the son of heaven, and through him heaven's will was to be carried out on earth. No ordinary person would presume to make sacrifice directly to heaven. That was the duty and right of the king alone. He alone could claim heaven as his ancestor. At midnight, on the 21st of December, the shortest day of the year, when the sun seemed to stand still, the king clad in blue, the color of the sky, would make his great sacrifice to heaven. And the yearly return of the sun, and the regular movement of the planets, and the dignified and orderly return of the seasons, the Chinese felt and recognized the divine order governing the universe. They spoke of it as Tao, or the way of heaven. If men would live in harmony with the great way of heaven, said the ancient sages, all will be well on earth. To do that, man must use the 5 virtues: kindness, good manners, knowledge, uprightness, and honor. To properly use the 5 virtues, a man must know and practice the 5 loyalties, which taught him the right behavior toward each person and everything on every occasion. This right behavior Chinese called the Li. Such was the teaching of the ancient wise men of China. Needless to say, it was not always lived up to as the centuries passed. About the time that Zoroaster was teaching in Persia, and just before Socrates and Plato lived in Athens, 2 great teachers of philosophers also lived and taught in China: Lao Tzu, the old philosopher, and Confucius, whose name people of the Western world would pronounce Confucius. By that time China had grown into a feudal state, divided into many walled towns and small districts ruled over by feudal lords always at war with one another. The strongest, the ones who ruled over most of these lesser rulers, were the kings of a dynasty known as the Chao. Luoyang, in Shenxi province, was their capital city. There, as state historian and keeper of the secret archives, lived the old philosopher Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, as it is also spelled. Lao Tzu taught the way of Tao as the way of life. There is a thing, he said in his quiet voice, that existed before heaven and earth. It cannot be seen or heard, yet it is everywhere. It is the life of all things. It is quiet, yet there is nothing that it does not do. I call it Tao. If princes and kings would keep to it, all things of themselves would be right. A man who understands Tao thinks of all people to himself. He gives, and the more he gives to others, the more he has for himself. He treats the good with goodness, and the bad also with goodness, and returns love for great hatred. He does not force his power upon them, nor contend with arms. The strength of his goodness is like that of water. Nothing is so yielding as water, yet it can wear away the hardest stone. Thus only the gentle overcome the strong, and he who fights with love will win the battle. Let us have sound knowledge to walk on the great way. Lao Tzu was about 50 years old when, to the east, in the province of Shandong, Confucius was born, the youngest of 11 children. Though his father died when he was 3, and as a child he had to work hard, he was given, nevertheless, a good education. Confucius loved to study the ancient Chinese books and wisdom of the sages. When he was about 19, he opened a private school himself, which became so popular that his pupils soon numbered 3,000. History, music, sciences, government, and rules of good behavior Confucius taught, but nothing about supernatural or mysterious spirits of any kind. If a man's conduct was right, his relation to the unseen spirits would take care of itself. In the year 517 B.C., it is said, when Confucius was 34 and Lao Tzu was 87, the younger man journeyed to Luoyang to consult the famous old philosopher. He first inquired as to certain points of etiquette had been taught by the ancient sages, and was dumbfounded by the answer he received. "All that is of no use to you, sir," said Lao Tzu. Goodness was not to be taught by rules and regulations. Pure goodness came from within, not from without. If a man's heart was pure and in harmony with Tao, his conduct with others would naturally be right. Confucius then asked Lao Tzu about the Tao, saying that he had read many books, but could not understand nor obtain it. "And why do you not?" answered Lao Tzu quietly. "This is the reason. You do not make room for it in your heart." Confucius left Lao Tzu, still bewildered, but with admiration for the beautiful spirit of the older man. "Today I saw Lao Tzu," he told his pupils. "He is like the dragon. I know the birds fly, I know the fishes swim. But as to the dragon, I cannot know how he bestride the wind and clouds when he rises heavenward." Lao Tzu was sad that men would not accept the way of life. The court of the Chao Emperor at Luoyang he saw filled with corruption and evil. High officials grew rich as they robbed the poor. Lao Tzu was old and discouraged with the evil ways of men. One day he left Luoyang and rode away alone on a water buffalo out through the last gate in the great wall into the desert, and he was seen no more. Before he left the city, however, he was met at the gate by the warden, who begged him not to depart without leaving some of his wisdom behind. So there in the gatehouse the old philosopher wrote a book of 5,000 words, containing 81 of his sayings. It is known as the Tao Te Ching. Ching meaning text, Tao the way of heaven, and Te the good life for men. Confucius had then become Chief Justice of his state, which he promptly put into such good order that the envious ruler of a neighboring state plotted to discredit him, and succeeded so well that Confucius was obliged to resign. Then for many years he traveled from state to state with his pupils, teaching good morals. The last years of his life he spent gathering together all the wisdom of the ancient sages into 5 texts, or Ching. In centuries following, his pupils wrote 4 more books called Shu, about the sayings of the master himself. These 9 books became the canon of China. The heart of his teaching, the best known saying of Confucius, is one upon which all great teachers of every land agree. While he was about 19, he was called upon to settle a dispute between some herdsmen who could not understand the fine points of the law. Confucius gave them this simple rule to go by: "Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you." More than 500 years had now passed, in these days of Caesar Augustus, since Lao Tzu and Confucius had lived and taught in China. And since then, what had happened? The teaching of Lao Tzu, so pure and simple that it seemed a mystery, difficult to understand, had been seized upon and degraded into the religion of Taoism, which was exactly the opposite of what Lao Tzu had taught. It was a mixture of cheap magic tricks, ignorant superstitions, spirit worship, and alchemy. A Taoist leader had been established, whose chief duty seemed to be to take money from the ignorant in exchange for charms against evil spirits. And in the next century, a Taoist professor would be trying to manufacture pills that would make people immortal. The teaching of Confucius, being exact rules of behavior, easily understood and not so easily changed, had become the rule of life in China. That was good, for they taught self-control, order, and honest living. But at the same time, those hard and fast rules, the worship of ancestors in the past, discouraged change and growth. Thus China, which had been for thousands of years a leader in civilization, was to fall behind. But that was far in the future. In this year of 1 BC, China was one of the 2 great empires in the world. And now, by the way of the old Silk Road, connecting those 2 empires, another religion, one from a foreign land, was finding its way into China. It was coming from India.